we adopt the flexible thinking of our founders and are a little more open-minded, we can make these reforms to make democracy better.
One man's humble quest to follow the Constitution's original meaning.
News has this terrible negative bias, but in the long run, life has gotten much better.
What does it mean to live by the Constitution?
That's a great question. I try to live like the founding fathers. Our democracy is fragile and could go away, so we can't take it for granted. We are coming apart. We need a glue. We need to do something to remember that we owe our society as well as our society owes us.
AJ, man, it is awesome to have you here on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
I am delighted to be here, and I'm going to try to be interesting enough that everyone makes it to the end of the podcast club. That's my goal, my quest.
I love your prep. I know you've read some of the books I've written, as well as you're dressed in character. What are you wearing? Can you describe it for me? I've never asked the guests what they're wearing before, but I can't help. Now I see this beautiful hat. What are you wearing?
I am fully clothed. I'm decent, but I also am wearing a tricorn hat. Not from the 1800s, but it is made in the same way. And it is because one of the things we're going to talk about, I believe, is my most recent book, The Year of Living Constitutionally, where I try to live like the founding fathers.
Okay, we are going to talk about that. I want to talk about one of them as a way to launch us into this project. One of the ones that I think is your favorite, as well as my favorite, and that is Benjamin Franklin. Okay, and you said that he embodied two of the greatest American characteristics. That's curiosity and experimental mindset. Curiosity is one of my 4 core values. It means a lot to me. I mean, I have a podcast, as you can imagine. If you're not curious, it probably won't be very good. Can you share a fun story or two or an example of Ben Franklin embodying those characteristics of being curious and having an experimental mindset?
Oh, yeah. I do love Ben Franklin. And he, by the way, would have a podcast, no doubt.
Oh, yeah.
He would be very interested. And, well, let me give you a couple of quick examples. One, this was towards the end of his life. I think he was 80 years old, and he was coming back from Europe for the last time. And you would think you would be playing shuffleboard or whatever they did on cruises back then. But no, he was busy doing scientific experiments on the trip. He was lowering bottles down into the depths of the ocean to see the water temperature. He was figuring out how wind affects playing cards, and it was just remarkable. Filling a book filled with ideas and questions. So he was one of the most curious people ever. Another related to curiosity, and I think you and I agree on this, is the importance of being curious enough to change your mind. You always want to be looking at what am I right about and what maybe do I need to evolve. And he was the most flexibly minded historical figure I've ever run across. He said during the Constitutional Convention, he said things like, the older I get, the less certain I am of my opinions. I mean, imagine today if politicians said that. Or he also told this lovely little parable. He said, there was this French lady, and she said to her sister, isn't it strange that I am the only person I have ever met who is correct on every single issue? And his point was, we are all that French lady. We all think we're correct on every issue. So he was very aware of his own cognitive biases, to use a phrase from more modern psychology. And I love that. So yeah, he is an intellectual hero. And there are many other examples, but I'll leave it there for now.
I think the willingness, ability, And skill, and I believe it's a skill, to change your mind should be celebrated, and it is not.
Oh,
You
absolutely.
celebrate it, and I think you do it in a great way by sharing these examples of amazing leaders who do it. And if you look in history, whether it's Lincoln or Franklin or a lot of our greatest leaders are celebrated for updating their thinking. Why, AJ, is this something that seems like you're called a flip flopper if you're a politician, or you say, oh, he doesn't have a backbone if the CEO of a company changes his or her mind? Why is this something that not only is it not celebrated, it's looked upon by a lot of people as a negative if you update your thinking or change your mind?
It is so insane, and I'm not 100% sure why. Like you say, people think it shows backbone, but the real backbone is having the courage to say I was wrong
Yep.
and change your mind and evolve, like you said, not flip-flop. One of my favorite, back to the founding fathers for 1 second, James Madison, who is considered the father of the Constitution. His very last words on planet Earth, he was in his deathbed and his niece was there and she said, he made a face and she said, what's the matter, uncle? And he said, oh, nothing, I just changed my mind. And then he died. So we don't know what he changed his mind. It could be the bicameral legislature, could be the wallpaper in his room. Who knows? But the fact was, right up until his last moments on earth, he was thinking, what can I change my mind about? And I agree. Leaders, the good leaders, are the ones who are flexible, who pivot, who evolve. You evolve or you die. And this idea that you have to stick with your beliefs no matter what. I mean, stick with your principles of doing good for the world or whatever your principles are, but change your beliefs as new evidence comes about.
If you were advising a CEO, or let's just say senior leaders to make it more broad, all leaders in an organization at times are going to be wrong. They're going to make mistakes. We're human beings, right? This is a part of living. What advice would you give them of how to approach their company, the marketplace, their stockholders, when they want to explain that they've updated their thinking, that they've changed their mind? What would be the best way to go about this?
Well, exactly. You don't have to say change the mind or flip flop, but evolve, I think, is a better word. And also create a corporate culture where changing your mind is celebrated
Yep.
instead of derided. And there is, I think it's a subreddit where you get points for changing your mind. I forget, it's called Change Your Mind or something. So let's try to adopt more of that, because that is it in one sense you're showing vulnerability, which I think is good for leaders, but you're also showing strength because you're saying, you know what, I am better than this. I don't have to cling to my past beliefs. I am looking at the bigger picture of what is good for the company, and I'm not going to just keep this belief because my little ego says it would be good for me to be right.
What I think it's actually a pretty good interview question if you're interviewing somebody for a leadership role. When is the last time you changed your mind about something? When is the last time you were wrong? When is the last time someone in your life told you you were wrong
Oh
and
yeah.
you had a good conversation? Because what it also gets at is, do you have people in your life who are willing to tell you you were wrong? I usually say, other than your spouse. When is the last time someone in your life has told you that you were wrong, and then you had a conversation about it and realized, oh, yeah, they're right, and your thinking was updated. And sometimes it makes people squirm a little bit. It's not meant to. It is truly meant to, for them to be thoughtful about, wait, do I have people in my life who I've surrounded myself with that can tell me I'm wrong? Because if not, that might be a red flag. And then, am I open to growth? Am I open to wisdom? I do not think it lacks integrity. I think it shows even more integrity to say, updated my thinking here, and now I believe in this. And I think, again, there are examples in history from how Lincoln thought about slavery, if you want to get really serious, to other ones that are not as serious as that in history, that I think the greatest of the greats, that's a skill they've developed.
100%. one of my favorite parts of researching this book on the Constitution was reading about the Constitutional Convention and how flexible and fluid their ideas were. And now we just think, oh, this is the way the government is supposed to be. It's etched in stone. This is like divinely inspired. But you should read some of these ideas that we're taking quite seriously. And who knows, maybe the world would have been better. There was a big debate, for instance, when someone brought up the idea that there should be one president in charge of the executive. And a lot of the delegates, one of them said, Are you? They didn't say, Oh, are you crazy? They paraphrased, Are you crazy? They actually said, That is the fetus of monarchy. You are going to create another monarchy. We just fought a bloody war to get rid of the monarchy. What are you thinking? And let's have a council of presidents, 3 presidents, 12 presidents. Ben Franklin brought up the idea of 12 presidents. So, and then eventually they decided, or James Wilson, the delegate in charge of this movement, decided it would be too hard to agree and make quick decisions with the technology of the day. So that's why we have one president. But they were very flexible. They were thinking way outside the box. And I would love to recapture some of that creativity in government, in leadership, wherever.
I'm pretty embarrassed, AJ, to admit that I did not really know anything about how this whole thing was formed. The
Well, neither did
constitutional
I.
the constitutional convention. I was like, wait, there was a convention? What happened in this room? And so, could you maybe give me a little history lesson, because I'm fascinated by this. I mean, I got some of it from your book, but I want to talk through it as well. How did they even think of the idea? Okay, we're going to have a constitutional convention where we're going to all go in a room and we're going to come out of the room and have a constitution. Like, who are
Yeah.
the major players? What did they say? Maybe a few more of the crazy ideas, and then what did they actually end up with, and how is that related to like what we have today?
Right. Well, it is a fascinating history and very relevant to thinking about leadership too. After we won the Revolutionary War, we had what were called the Articles of Confederation, which was very loose. Think of the European Union. It was each of the states were almost like an independent country,
Yep.
and uh, they had their own taxes. There was no way that the federal government could tax. They had their own armies, and it was very confusing. And it was just going down a
So
bad
states
path.
were
It was
not they were
chaos.
not united.
They were
Right.
not united.
Right.
Exactly. They were just loosely affiliated. And so several of these visionaries, like Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, not Jefferson, he was away, Madison, that they realized unless we get some sort of unity, this is going to break apart and we're going to have 13 countries. So they called this convention. Now, what's interesting is they kind of broke their vows by creating a new constitution. They had been sent by their states just to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they said, "Let's scrap it and start anew." They were revolutionary thinkers. They decided we need a stronger central government. We can keep the states so that there's some sort of balance of power there, and then they had to figure out how to do it. No one had ever created a government from scratch that was not headed by a king, and so it was a long, hot summer. It was 4 months about of them debating in committees and subcommittees. They kept the windows of Independence Hall closed because they didn't want anyone eavesdropping. Like, try to imagine if there was tweeting then. Like, we would not have a constitution because the public outcry would be like, wait, what? You're taking away states' rights, making a national government? No way. So it was, so I am glad for the secrecy, the NDA in that sense. And in the end, there were tons of compromises. No one was perfectly happy with the way it came out. And it's a brilliant document in some ways, but there are huge flaws in others that have come out over the decades. But they also knew that it was a flawed. They knew it was a flawed document, like we were talking about. So they built in a way to change it, to amend it.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, they didn't realize how hard it would be to amend when we have two. They didn't foresee these two rigid parties that we have now. So I think they would have made it much easier to change had they known about our current system.
What was
But
like the parties, or was there even a party system? What was that like at the beginning?
well, pretty soon after, they formed into parties, which drove George Washington crazy. He hated them. But
Was he
they,
one or the other, or what was he considered?
well, they're the two basic parties were the ones who were much more state rights,
Okay.
and then which were called the Republican Jeffersonian Republicans, and then the Federalists, which were much more national, should have more power. So it's always been that contention from the start. But Madison knew that there would be factions, he called them, but he always imagined, well, it's a big country. We're going to have like a dozen different factions, and they'll all be changing, and they'll be forming alliances with temporarily with one another. So he saw it almost more like what they have in Europe, where they've got a libertarian party, a green party, um, but for unfortunately, I think we are now stuck with these two parties, even though people in the two party, like people in the Republican Party, have widely divergent views on many, but they have to stick to it because that's all we have. We have two flavors.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the majority of people, they're like somewhere in the middle of the extremes of those two. And that's just facts based on polling, what we're seeing. And that's what's frustrating, I think, about the current day. So I want to get
Exactly.
to you. And, you do like the year of living biblically, which was amazing and, best-selling book. There's a million stories about that. But now you decide, you know what? I want to do the year of living constitutionally. Can you take me back to the idea, the thought process, and then the beginning stages of what does it mean to live by the Constitution?
Oh yeah, I would love to. I mean, I love this project, and it was sort of a sequel to the one you mentioned before, the Year of Living Biblically,
Yep.
where I tried to live by all the rules of the Bible. So the Ten Commandments, the famous ones, but also the lesser known ones in the Old Testament, where uh, it says you can't shave the corners of your beard. I didn't know where the corners were, so I just let the whole thing grow, and I looked like Gandalf. I it's the Old Testament says you should stone adulterers, so it's like, all right, I'll try. And I used very small stones like pebbles, so no one went to jail. But it was an amazing experience, and it was a lot about how literally should we take the Bible, but it was also about what practices from ancient society are relevant now that maybe we should look at again. And I did find gratitude, forgiveness, community, and I always thought I could do the same thing with the year of living constitutionally because it's very similar in many ways. A revered document that has a huge impact on how we live our lives. So I thought, let me try to live it as literally as possible. First to see how should we interpret it? How much should we evolve the meaning? But also, are there ideas from the 18th century that are worth revisiting? So I did it. I bore a musket. I bought a musket off ye old internet, and I bore it around New York City where I live. I gave up social media and wrote pamphlets with a goose quill and handed them out on the street. I boarded a soldier in my apartment. I quartered a soldier, as is my Third Amendment right. And it was amazing. And I do think there are parts of 18th century that we kind of already talked about. But things like changing your mind, slowing down your thinking, self-sacrifice as a way to happiness, and much more. But it was a bizarre year. My wife was not happy about much of it, but it was fascinating at the same time. And I feel empowered after it. I feel empowered and more optimistic about our democracy,
Really?
which
Why is that?
well, I feel that there are things we can do to make it better. And and if we adopt the flexible thinking of our founders and are a little more open minded, we can make these reforms to make it a better democracy. And I saw it personally because one of the things that I resurrected was the idea of election cakes. Now, back in the 1790s, elections were like a huge festival. It was not quite Coachella. I won't go that far. There was no hallucinogens, but they did have rum punch, they had music, they had farmers markets, and they had election cakes. And the idea was let's celebrate this amazing fact that we can have some influence on who our leaders are, which was unheard of. So I said, let's get back to that festive mindset. And I got people in all 50 US states to bake cakes at in November for the last elections. And I'm going to do it again in this November. And we had hundreds of cakes. People were so creative and entrepreneurial. They had peach cakes in Georgia. They had cherry cakes in Michigan where they have cherry. And it was awesome. And people were like, this is like a little sliver of happiness. I'm so depressed about the way politics are. Even something, just having something proactive and positive to do, like bake a cake and bring it to the polls, has made me more optimistic. So it's a start. I'm not saying cake is going to cure it, but let's start with cake and then we can move on to getting people to, first of all, get out there, and secondly, make democracy better.
So I'm an optimistic person. I like surrounding myself with optimistic people. It's why I'm a huge fan of yours. However, with the current setup of the news being if it bleeds, it leads,
Oh,
with social media, it seems like making people mad is what creates engagement, which then keeps you on the social media platform, which then they could sell ads, and that's, around and round we go, right? And so
right.
there's a lot of things kind of going against us when it comes to news and social media. And so most people are not going to go do what you did and get off of those, write with a quill pen. Like, they're not going to do that. What are some things we could do beyond the cakes, which it was cool to see you write about the fact that it was like one of the most inspiring things you ever seen when I read your acknowledgments about that, which I thought was really neat. But what are some other things we could do to maybe think about how it used to be, but knowing that we still are in this environment that is thrown in our face constantly, a lot of negativity in order to drive clicks and engagement?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I have lots to say. Let me give you a couple. First of all, we should remember you're right. The news has this terrible negative bias, but in the long run, life has gotten much better.
Oh, yeah.
And we still have a long, long way to go. But you read about, it was the 1700s. It was sexist, racist, dangerous. Medicine consisted of things like a tobacco smoke enema, where they would literally blow smoke up your ass because to cure your stomach ailments. Crazy. So let's remember that we have made huge strides in longevity, in quality of life. So that should give us some optimism. Second, you're right. We have a fire hose of negative news coming at us all the time. In the 1790s, you got your news twice a week. Ben Franklin's newspaper came out twice a week. So you read it for an hour, and then you would have time to digest and come up with solutions. And I don't think that's realistic for most of us, but I think it is realistic. Let's set aside half an hour a day to read the news and then try to stop. Don't go on the internet every 10 minutes to see what the latest blip is. You don't need to know every time the polls go half a point in one direction. You can check in on the polls every month, and you will be happier. You will have more time to think. Another one is, yes, I wrote with a quill. I wrote much of the book with a quill, and I found it amazing because, first of all, you didn't have the internet pulling you away with distractions, the dings and the pings. you were able to, it changed the way I thought. I thought more deeply and more nuanced. Now, I don't think everyone should get a quill, although I found it very fun. But even just writing by longhand your thoughts at the start of the day, or just making sure to cut yourself off from the internet using one of those cold turkey programs, you cannot write really deep, coherent work when you have messages coming in every 30 seconds. So those are just some small, I don't know, we call them life hacks or small behavioral changes that I think would improve our lives vastly.
Speaking of Ben Franklin, and I was messaging with Sam Parr about this, and this is from the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, where he told a story about his dad actually criticized his writing.
Mm.
And one of the ways he worked to get better at this was he would find people who he thought were amazing writers, and then he would literally hand write word for word their writing to almost put it into his mind that he could write like that. And I know this is a bit of an aside, but I think all leaders need to become excellent writers, and the only way to do that is to do it a lot, because that will make you a better communicator. Leaders have to communicate if they want to do a really good job. And so he would find amazing writing and then literally copy it word for word on paper or whatever they use. And like we could do that too. Like we could read AJ Jacobs books and just copy them word for word on piece of paper, or whoever you like to read. And I think like, huh. And also what it does there, AJ, is it slows you down a bit, right? You're
Right.
not online, you get a book and you get a piece of paper and a pen if you want, and just write it down. And that is one of the ways that there's a lot of science that will help you become a better communicator, a better writer. And I'm like, huh, I never really thought of that, but that makes sense.
Yeah. No, he was great. I love that one. There's another thing he did where he would read an essay and then wait a day and then try to rewrite the essay from memory. What are the
Ooh.
points? So it was really good for his critical thinking and his memory skills. Another part of the autobiography of Ben Franklin that I adopted was he really was the first self-help writer, and first American at least. And he prints his schedule for the day in his autobiography. And every day he wakes up and asks the question, what good shall I do today? And I love that. So I adopted it. I wrote it with my quill pen and I put it over my desk. What good shall I do today? And it's just such a good North Star, because say I'll put something on Instagram and it doesn't get enough likes, I'll start to get furious. What's wrong with people? These idiots. And then I'll look at my what good shall I do today? And I'll be like, wait, is this the best use of my time? No. Uh, and it's not just me trying to be a saint, it's for better for my mental health when I remind myself, don't get angry at these ridiculous small things. Just try to focus on making the pursuit of happiness for yourself and for others.
Well, so can you walk me through like typical day or typical days living constitutionally? If you're talking, you have this idea of what good shall I do today, and that being a guiding question. But what did it look like from when you woke up to when you went to, because you're also, family man, you have to live a life, right? But you get so dedicated to your books that, you got to be basically in character a lot of the time in order to live biblically or live constitutionally. What was a typical day like?
Well, I would wake up and look at that. What good can I do today? I would put on, yeah, I find dressing the part is a surprisingly and there are studies on this, that when
Mhm.
you change your clothes, it changes the way you think. So I found this when I dressed in a robe biblically. And for this one, so I tried to wear my tricorn hat and I would put on my breeches. And one thing that it did, which was actually sounds silly, but was profound. It made me so grateful for some of the modern conveniences we have, like elastic. I will never take elastic for granted again because I had these socks that were made in the 18th century style and they were stockings. There's no elastic. So they would pool around, they would create this puddle around my ankles. So every day I had to put on little belts, sock belts. They weren't even garters. Garters are more sophisticated. These are just like belts at the top of your socks. And the amount of time that I spent putting on sock belts, every time I would think, you know what? Let's be thankful for antibiotics, but also for elastic. And then I would go out on my adventures, whether it was bearing a musket or, I mean, one of my favorite parts, and this relates to keeping an open mind, was interviewing experts and just being relentlessly curious because there is so much to learn. And I tried to talk to people from all over the political spectrum because I want to get outside my bubble. I think that if we just are in our echo chamber, you're not going to learn anything. So I would talk to the most conservative people and the most liberal people, and I loved it. It was a fascinating year.
What are some of the coolest, most surprising things you learned from those people that you interviewed?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I think one is that that the past really was a foreign country. That one of my advisors, I told him I'm going to try to get into the mind of the 18th century American, and he says, "Good luck with that." He's like, that's like trying to get inside the mind of an oyster. It's just so different, and so yes, I never achieved it, but I did start to see the world a little differently, and one of the main ways was this idea of virtue and self-sacrifice was huge back then. Nowadays, virtue has kind of people say, "Oh, you're virtue signaling. You're just, you're trying to show off how virtuous you are." They took it very seriously. And what it meant was putting the community, putting the country, putting the world um, ahead of yourself or at least on par with yourself. So when you make a decision, you are thinking of others. Now, we are rightly very concerned about our individual rights. I'm a big fan of individual rights. But back then, those rights were balanced with your duty to the community. And that could be anything from being on the bucket brigade where you put out a fire, everyone's a volunteer fireman, or it could be everyone had to serve all male adults had to serve in the militia. So I think that is something that's missing. I don't think mandatory military service, I don't want to go back to that, but maybe some countries have like a year or even a month where you would do something for your community or your country, AmeriCorps, whatever it is. I think we need that glue because we are coming apart. We need a glue. We need to do something to remember that we owe our society as well as our society owes us.
So I looked at some research in regards to that
Mm.
and saw that I think Americans, for the most part, give more money to causes and charity than any other country. And I'm curious, I do see it's coming apart and there's not as much service to community, but we do still have people who are willing to sacrifice and serve our country and fight overseas and do things that I've never done that I'm so, so grateful for. We do seem to be pretty good at giving financially. So, what do you think it is as far as like we don't have that same, at least what we used to have when it comes to how we show up for our community, for our country, for the world, even though there are some stats that show we are still good at it in some places?
Yeah, which is great. I love to hear that. But as you say, it's in some places. I mean, first of all, I love that we give money, but I also think that binding people together, the best way to do it is not by giving money, but by doing activities together. And there's
Yes,
lots of research
100%.
on that. So, yeah, if we can together solve a problem together, even if we're conservative and liberal, then that is a massive move forward. I would also say the problem is, even though I think that most of us share many goals, uh, because of the fracturing of the media and social media, we live in two different realities. And there's always been, as we talked about, there's always been factions, there's always been parties, but I don't think they saw the other party as inherently evil or stupid, which is what we have now. And it is a real problem. So, approaching the other side, there's a phrase I love from child psychology: when you're parenting, don't get furious, get curious.
Yep.
And I try to apply that to everything. So don't get furious at the other side, get curious. Why do they believe what they do? What evidence can I present that might change their mind? If I can't change their mind, how can we still move forward in a productive way? All of these things are about curiosity.
The other part about that, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, AJ. So I love the name AJ. I have a brother named AJ. I was just talking to him yesterday about this, and one of the things that he said, and I see him has lived this out his whole life, is you don't have to have an opinion about everything, especially things that I don't know what I'm talking about. So I just don't have an opinion because I haven't done enough research or have an understanding, and so in that point, I just stay quiet. And I'm like, yeah, I think that's great. I think more of us should be that way.
Oh
We don't
my
have
God.
to have an opinion on every single thing going on. Some things we just kind of keep it moving, and you just, I don't know. I don't really know what's going on with that. I'm
Oh
just going
my
to kind
God.
of keep it moving. You know what I'm
That
saying?
is that is music to my ears. I
Yeah.
have been preaching this gospel. You don't have to, and in fact, if you haven't researched it deeply, don't have a strong opinion about it. I
Yeah.
think that is my strong opinion. We don't need strong opinions about it. And going back to the founding fathers, in his autobiography, Ben Franklin says, when you express an opinion, it is much better strategically and just morally to say, well, it seems to me, or from what I can tell, these types of things, as opposed to saying, um, the tax rate is too high. Well, it seems to me the tax rate is too high, and here are the reasons. So yes, but I totally agree. You don't have to have an opinion, and I've seen it sometimes. I was at some conference, and there was a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and someone asked him about politics, and he said, "I don't know. That's not my specialty." And he's the Nobel Prize winner. So yeah, let's be like that. And again, as with changing our mind, let's try to elevate not having a strong opinion as a virtue as opposed to a weakness.
Yes. Yeah. Saying, I don't know. I'm curious to learn. I'll ask questions. I'm definitely
Exactly.
curious, but I'm not really certain of it, so I don't have an opinion. You mentioned gratitude when you're talking about living constitutionally. About, oh man, there was some tough things about it. Even something you take for granted, obviously, like putting on your socks. Nobody thinks about that anymore. But I love this quote from John Quincy Adams that you write about in your book, and where he says, "Gratitude, when it takes possession of the bosom, fills the soul to overflowing and scarce leaves room for any other sentiment or thought." And you write, I agree with the sixth president. Can you share more about the importance of just showing up with gratitude like John Quincy Adams did?
Oh yeah. I mean, to me, curiosity that we've talked about and gratitude are two of my favorite human drives. And I actually wrote an entire book about gratitude
Yep.
called Thanks a Thousand. And the idea was because I, like most people, have a negative bias. I'm really good at noticing the three or four things that go wrong instead of the hundreds that go right. It's sort of, I, I think of it as the Larry David side of the brain versus the Mr. Rogers side, right? The negative complaining versus the appreciative. So I did this exercise to try to build up my Mr. Rogers side, which was I took my morning cup of coffee, something super simple, and I decided to thank every single person who had anything to do with that cup of coffee. So I thanked the barista at my coffee shop, but I flew to South America and I thanked the farmers. I thanked the truck driver. who drove the coffee beans, the logo designer, the person who made the streets so the truck driver could go. I mean, I took it a little, took it like out of control. And I got to 1,000 people, but I could have gone to 100,000. And like you say, it is such a key to, like John Quincy Adams says, it makes you it empowers you. I mean, I there's lots of studies. It's good for business and leaders to encourage gratitude, and I think it makes you more solution oriented. So, like when I am grateful for water, like the fact that I can a turn a little metal spigot and get drinkable water. Think of the hundreds of people that it took to make that a reality. It was, the people who park rangers who work at the reservoir, the people who built the pipes, and so many people. And so that not only makes me grateful for it, but it also makes me think, you know what? I want to have this available to everyone because there are billions of people in the world now who cannot turn on a spigot. They don't have drinkable water available. So to me, it's the closest thing we have to a miracle drug. I guess Ozempic is might be in it, but it's got some downsides. Gratitude has very few downsides.
Well, especially when you are setting your default setting to be seeking it out, you
Mm.
just see it more. And if you say like, "Hey, I want to say a specific thank you, or even give a compliment to somebody." There was a soccer dad the other night at a game, and you know how soccer dads can be, where they can yell at the refs and they can be bad. Well, this particular one was the opposite. He was awesome. I love how he yells for his daughter. Like, he's so positive. He's never, ever, ever negative. And he just like juices me up. And I asked my daughter, I'm like, you hear Evelyn's dad, the way he yells for Evelyn? And she's like, we love it. I'm like, I do too. It's so great because he's like, they can't get you, Ev. They can't get you. You're too fast, you know? And it's like, this is the way to be. And I think though you seek it out and you tell them, and like their face lights up, and it just encourages more of that. Like, I want to seek out positivity. I want to seek out people. I want to be grateful for the dad who's awesome, not necessarily one who's yelling at the refs all the time, who I'd rather just keep their mouth shut. And I just think that style of living, everyone smiles. It's enjoyable. It's fun. Let's encourage more of that stuff, not just the negative ones, but the positive ones.
Oh yeah. And for this project on gratitude, I called or wrote some of my business mentors and said, and it's also a little awkward because, stereotypically men are not supposed to be vulnerable and emotional. So
Mhm.
I said, I know this is awkward and I hope I don't make you uncomfortable, but I just want to tell you how much you meant to me and what you taught me. And I gave him examples of things I still do. And I could tell from his responses how moved he was. So yeah, I am a big fan of sort of the awkward but delightful thanking of people in your life.
You will love it. I'm talking to everybody now, AJ, and I know, just like you did, this should be a good reminder. Maybe even press pause and just, if you want to be less awkward, just send the text, but make it really specific, really genuine. It'd be even better if you write a letter, if you ask them to lunch or you called them, and tell people why you appreciate them. Tell them
Totally.
how their impact on you has impacted your life. I guarantee you will enjoy it. It's a guarantee. It's a lock if you tell people, like, be specific. It's just it's pretty easy. It's not a hard thing to do, but it's so impactful. And then again, it gets you into hopefully the habit
Yeah.
of that. My friend Brooke Cups has Thankful Thursday, and so every Thursday he texts 3 people that he's thankful for, and
Oh.
sometimes he calls them, and he also writes them handwritten notes. And so he knows every Thursday I am writing 3 letters, I'm sending 3 texts, and now all the students do it that he teaches, and so Thankful Thursday is just the thing. I'm like, yes, that's a great way to show gratitude and to get your default setting in, like looking for and seeking out people and things to be grateful for, as
Oh,
opposed to
that is
being
so
upset
good.
about.
I
Yeah.
love Thankful Thursday. I also think, and I've talked about this in many of my books, how behavior shapes your thoughts and your mood. So even if during this project with gratitude, I would wake up in a grumpy mood, but I would force myself to do what your friend did and send notes or call people, and my mind would catch up with my behavior, and I would start to feel grateful. And there's a great saying, it's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting. And
Mm.
I love that. And just to give you one example, I was doing it to strangers, which is even more awkward than doing it to like people you haven't talked to in 10 years. But I remember I called the woman who does pest control for the warehouse where the coffee beans are stored. And I tracked her down and I called her and I said, this is a little, I know it sounds strange, but I want to thank you for keeping the insects out of my coffee. And she said, well, that is strange, but thank you. I never get any recognition. And she's like, this made my day. And in turn, that made my day because I'm like, oh, I'm giving joy to someone else. And that made me feel good. So even if you're feeling bold, find the designer of a logo you love and just send them a note over Facebook like, oh, love the logo. I'm a stranger, but I'm just a fan. Whenever I get notes from strangers about my books, I cannot get enough of them. It's just so nice. And the more specific, the better.
That's the juice, man. That's the fuel. That helps, especially when the days are tough. That feedback is helpful. Like, hey, your work positively impacted my life. It was part of our dinner table conversation last night. Like, oh, whew, this is awesome. Like, I got some juice for the day. Speaking of this, there's some key learnings in the book. And I want to dig into this one here before we run about the fox mindset trumps the hedgehog mindset. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a famous story by the writer Isaiah Berlin, and it's based on a Greek idea that there are two types of thinkers in the world. There are the hedgehogs and the foxes. The hedgehogs see the world through a single lens. Everything is seen, and that could be people who are ultra religious see everything through religion. Could be Marxism. You see everything through Marxism. And then there are the foxes who see the world through many different lenses. They say, well, let's look at this phenomenon from this angle, from the religious angle, from the economic angle. Let's look at it from the aesthetic angle. And both ways of looking at the world, I think, have their pros and cons. But overall, I would say we need much more fox-like thinking in our life and much less hedgehog thinking because it's that flexibility. It's being able to come up with solutions and not being stuck in this one black and white way of looking at the world. And that's partly what my conclusion about the Constitution was. When we're looking at the Constitution, if you're making a judgment about it, look at the original meaning. That is a very important part of it, but also look at how it affects the world today. What was the purpose of the law? How will it affect our descendants? What do other countries do? And I find that a much better way to come up with political solutions.
I was just gonna say, it feels like that's a through line of the book is thinking more like a fox, being agile, being willing to update. And that's hard because some people want to take certain historical texts like the Bible or the Constitution literally, whereas maybe it's not necessarily meant to be taken that way with all of it. And that's where the nuance comes in. The world, it's another thing I learned after now 580 plus of these, AJ, and 9 years of podcasting is I was more of a black and white kind of here's the rule or not, like that type of a thinker. And as I've spoken with so many wise people, there's a few things I've learned from them, a lot of things, but one of them is the world is so gray and so nuanced, and there's almost nothing like Paulina Pompliano told me this when I record with her, and she's really great, just that you just become more reasonable. You become more open. You realize like, oh, I interviewed somebody from a completely different background to me, and maybe that's why he made some really stupid decisions. Then it's not like how I grew up with amazing parents and brothers, and they steer me in a direction to not make the same dumb decisions that that other person did. Maybe I should get curious about him and his upbringing and the fact that he didn't have this, as opposed to just judging that person. So I think it feels like you have become, even though you already were, more reasonable and more grayer thinking and less black and white as you've done all of this work over the past year.
Absolutely. And I love that. And I love that you have, like we said right up front, the importance of changing your mind, of evolving is a better way to put it. It would be great if everyone had a podcast for 9 years where they could talk to. Not everyone has your talent for interviewing, but I love the idea that it's helped you see all these different perspectives and made you a more nuanced thinker. That is awesome.
It is a piece of advice I actually give to any leader. You don't necessarily have to have a podcast, but go out into the world and interview people. I've done email interviews. I did email interviews prior to even having a podcast, where I just would try to have the best questions possible, the most useful ones for what I was trying to learn, and email them. Not everybody would want to do it because it takes a lot of work to respond to that, but I still save a lot of those email interviews I've done. I've interviewed people in person. My first boss in my first ever sales job, Rex Caswell, helped me set up interviews with the top 10 performers of the Stack rankings in the organization so I could learn what they did. So I think just being curious and interviewing people and trying to learn from a and even among those 10 people, by the way, AJ, and this was a long time ago, wildly different ways they went about their business. They all ended up in the top of the Stack rankings, but why? And I was like, oh, there's so much to learn if you're willing to be curious and ask people questions. To close, this gets back to being, I think, positivity. And you write the fact that we control the sun. Okay, that's the highlight of this. The sun, now I'll get to the story. The sun carved on the back of George Washington's wooden chair at the Constitutional Convention, okay? The sun was cut in half by the horizon. And the question you write about was it rising or was it setting? And at the end of the convention, Ben Franklin said he was convinced it was rising. America had a bright future. And I believe the world is built by optimists. We've talked about this a little bit. And you said whether the sun sets or rises on democracy, that's up to us, we the people. Can you talk more about controlling the sun and the sun carved on the back of George Washington's wooden chair at the Constitutional Convention?
Wow, I love that parable. And I do think that the sun can continue to rise on America and the world, but like you said, it's up to us. It's not up to gravity. We have to get out there and we have to bake election cakes. We have to reform government. We have to get rid of gerrymandering. We have to do all of these and not take it for granted. So that goes back to the gratitude. All of these things are democracy is fragile and could go away. So we can't take it for granted. We have to be optimistic and realize that life has gotten much, much better over the years. Let's continue. Let's continue. Let's see that as something that motivates us to keep working to make life better. So yes, I agree with Ben Franklin in the end, with an asterisk, that the sun will continue to rise if we commit to it.
The book is called The Year of Living Constitutionally, One Man's Humble Quest to Follow the Constitution's Original Meaning. AJ, man, I'm just a massive fan of your work, the way you think, how curious you are. I really appreciate you coming here and being on today, and I'd love to continue our dialogue as we both progress.
Totally. I loved it too. Oh, by the way, hello to the end of the podcast club. Thank you for staying. And I think, yes, I think we are like-minded in so many ways, and it was a joy to talk. So I'd love to.
It would be fun. I would love to take you out to dinner, man. It would be fun just to hear you riff on whatever the new project. Speaking of that, I'm glad I remembered. What's the next year of, or maybe some of the best ideas of year ofs that AJ Jacobs, or maybe even somebody else could think about doing? What have you thought of?
Oh, yeah. Well, I have a big stack, and I'm not sure which one to do next. I have a Substack called Experimental Living that I'm starting, and I want people to suggest ideas. One idea that I mentioned earlier before the show to you, people have suggested that I try to become the greatest lover in the world and do all the positions in the Kama Sutra. And I did bring it up to my wife, and she said, absolutely not. That just sounds dreadful. And I have to agree with her. I mean, I leave that to a younger person with more flexibility in their back.
Maybe that's for somebody else. So maybe your apprentice could try that one. No, I love it, man.
Exactly.
I'm excited to read your Substack as well. But thank you again for being such a prolific writer and putting your thoughts out into the world for all of us to judge. I would urge us to be more curious than judgmental. But this has been awesome, man, and I look forward to the next one.
Well, thank you. And thank you for putting yourself out into the world and making it better.
Trying, man. Trying. All right. Thanks, man.